Poetry Friday webinars. I am your host, Shelly Sanchez Terrell, and we are here today thanks to American TESOL. We are here every Friday, and you are more than welcome to invite guests. We have recordings at if you go to youtube.com/user/ATESOL, you'll be able to find hundreds of our webinars recorded. Now, April is a special time. It's a National Poetry Month. So that's why we are having this webinar today to be able to share with you some great resources for teaching your students with poetry. So a lot of the resources you'll find are great for the entire year. But especially this month, you want to try one of these ideas with your learners so you can celebrate this time. Now, poetry is a really wonderful way to teach any type of subject. Poetry is a way to tie emotion into a subject. So even if you teach science, if you teach math, and especially teaching language, teaching English and the language arts, poetry is a way that your students can be able to see what others find fascinating about a topic. So, for example, with science, a lot of times students are overwhelmed by those kind of subjects. But if they read a poem about, the universe and how the universe or the sun rotates, and then it becomes more interesting. You become more fascinated, and that's what poetry does. Is you can find a poem. Pretty much anyone can find a poem that really appeals to them and really tugs at their heart. The other great thing about poetry is that, especially for language learners, when language learners are able to write a poem in a language, then that means that you have understood different aspects of that language. Poetry has different phrases. The grammar isn't always follow a certain rule. And so you really have to know a language to be able to write a poem in that language. And so writing poetry can be very difficult for our students, but it's or challenging, but it's also really wonderful how you can be able to inspire your students to be able to do more and learn more by creating, by writing their own poetry, and also being inspired by poets from everywhere around the world. And that's the other great part of it. The other day, I was actually listening to National Public Radio, and they had digital poets. They were featuring digital poets from Africa. And so I got to learn a lot about the country of Africa and the emotions and what's going on there because of listening to these different poets. And that's the great thing about poetry as well, is that if you introduce your students to different voices around the world, they really capture what's happening in the country. They really capture the spirit, the emotions, especially within a time period. So that's really interesting as well. So I'm going to share with you tons of ideas and resources, but at poets.org, they actually have 30 ways that you can celebrate National Poetry Month. Now, I've been sharing this on social media, this post, because I think it's really wonderful, but there's a poem a day is one of the great suggestions, and that's actually an app as well. You can carry that around, and every day it's just going to send you a poem, and that's free, so that's really great. They also have, if you're looking for ideas like poems that you want to teach, they have a weekly series on poets.org where they actually give you lessons. If you sign up for Teach This Poem, it's a weekly series where you get ideas on how to teach poetry. So I think that's really wonderful as well. And the great thing here is that a lot of these ideas, you can just take any of them and you can have fun with them. There's ideas for adults, teenagers, adolescents, and young children as well. So if you look at number 15, I think that one's a great one for young learners. It's chalk a poem on the sidewalk. How fun would that be for kids to be able to write their own poem on the sidewalk at the school for everyone to read? So that's a really great idea. It's a way to get them outside, especially if you're having really nice weather like we are in Texas. and also a great way to get your students moving around, and also it can be very creative. There's also, of course, where you can set up an open mic, and I've done this with my students, young learners, children, where I had them create magnetic poems with magnetic poetry, and then they read it in open mic with music playing in the background. So the kids had so much fun doing this, and you'd be surprised because even the boys had fun doing this as well. So you can find many more ideas by visiting that post. Another really great resource is poetryfoundation.org. At Poetry Foundation, you can find learning resources. They have podcasts, they have audio poems, so you can teach them as listening. They also have lesson plans. They have recommended poems and poets for children. They have ideas for teaching poetry with children. They even have like laureates for different age groups. They have the poet laureate for children. They have one for also for adults as well. So you can find a lot of resources there. It's pretty easy to navigate. You just click on the tabs. So you can go to the Learning Lab, is where they have ways to teach with different poems. They also have core learning poems. They have articles for students and teachers. And they also, if you teach higher level, if you teach adult or academic English as an academic for academic purposes, or if you teach college students, university students, then you can review the essays on poetic theory. So you can have your students actually look more into the language, the metaphors, the figurative language, what poems mean, the literary devices behind them. So I want to show you some of the places where you can find some really great poems to teach with. And one idea is, once you are inspired by one of these poems, you can have your students replicate the format. So that's one of the easiest ways to teach with poetry, is to introduce students to a poem you like. Let them study the format, discuss, what is the format, what is happening, what is the meaning, what is the figurative language. And then after that, for them to write a poem using that format. Or if you're just trying, if the focus is on the subject matter, then it could be for them to write a poem about that subject matter. So in this case, I wanted to show an example of mathematical poetry. And the reason why is because this is a very popular form that's easy for learners to begin with. Writing a long poem can be very difficult for students. So you can have fun by getting them to write shape poems, or poems that have some kind of shape within them. Here's a great example by this one. This one actually shows a mathematical equation. That's what it's in the shape of. But students can do many different types of shapes. They can do what's called a diamond poem. Well, it's a diamante poem. That's pretty easy to write, but basically they just write a poem, the words within a shape. So here, the poem actually says 1,000, let's see, 1,000 poems full of falling snow. And then it has children divided by Christmas. And then you see the word cold. So it's CLD, and the remainder is the O, and then there's more poem there. So it's written like it's a division problem here. And that's what the poem is about. So I think that's really interesting as well. And if you teach CLAR, content language integrated learning, you teach topics as well. So here are a bunch of haikus. Haikus are really great for students that are able to, it's 3 lines, so it's very simple form. It has its origins from Japan, so that's really great because you get to teach culture, you get to teach, you can teach what is the history, why they have this format. You can give some great examples of different types of haikus. The Japanese haiku is actually quite different than the Western haiku. So the haikus that we're usually familiar with are Western ones. But Japanese haikus were the traditional form. They follow a basic format. Your students don't have to rhyme. The other one with the shape poems, they don't have to rhyme with those either. So I think these are great ways. They just write 3 lines. So a haiku is so much easier than getting your students to write a complete poem. So I think these are the first type of poems that you can introduce to students. Poetry, poems, the haiku, and the shape forms. With the science ones, they actually, this Twitter account, if you check, it not only shows them a haiku, but when you click the link, the students are able to actually learn more. The teacher writes these haikus to inspire his students to learn more about that, to read an article and learn more about that science phenomenon or theory. So now that we've seen ways to kind of start and introduce poems and where you can find some good poems recommended for children and also recommended for, and if you go to my blog post, if you go to a Teacher Bootcamp, and I'm gonna put that in the bottom right now, teacherbootcamp.com, you can find my latest post on teaching poetry, and you'll find different places to teach, to find poems for children, poems for teens, things like that. So after you introduce the poem and teach with it, you can begin to get your students to write poetry. So what are the great tools to write poetry with? Well, the poetrymachine.net is really great for adolescents, teenagers, and older learners. The Poetry Machine, you don't have to register anything. All you do is you type in your name, and in this and then right here you just type in responses to questions. It's going to ask you a lot of questions like, what is your favorite color? How do you feel when this happens? And so it's a great way to so you're practicing that language where you're answering questions. You have to understand what the question is saying, so you practice writing. But the other great thing is that what it does is after you answer all these questions, it actually, those answers become your poem. So it's walking you through the steps of creating a poem. So it's interesting for students to be able to see, all the responses together, see what poem is made, and then they can edit it to make it more poetic, to match more of a poetic form. The other one, and the great thing is you don't have to register. You just go and you can test it out. The one that is good for children and also adolescents, middle school students, is this one it's basically the same thing. It's what's called an interactive. Students click play, and then they're walked through and actually taught different types of poetic forms, the sonnet, all kinds of different poetic forms, and they also have to answer or are quizzed and things like that. So it walks them. That actually is a complete tutorial where they engage with it and they learn about different forms of poetry, and then also write in the style of that is presented to them. So this one is really great for children. It's a lot like the first one I showed you, except it actually does a lot more teaching and actually more of a lesson. One of the easiest ways for your students to be inspired to write poetry is by having magnetic poetry. Now, I used to get the magnetic kits when I was teaching children, and this was before we really had access to the internet or anything like that. And what I would do is I would get the cookie trays, and then the magnets, they would form them within the cookie trays. Now, magnetic poetry, I found out quite quickly, it's very expensive. So it's great that you can go online and you can actually do this online. It's a lot cheaper, and your students will have fun playing with it. This is my favorite site for magnetic poetry, and the reason why is because your students have all of these kits they can choose from. They can choose from just original set of words. They can choose from nature if you're writing nature poems, a mustache poetry, which will just have funny words. It can be about any topic. A poet one, where it has more words related to that. A geek one, and of course, romance, or romantic poetry, love poetry. What students do, it's very simple. They don't even have to register. All they do is they choose which set they want, or you can direct them. You can say, okay, we're using the love kit to create a poem about, and then give them a topic. And then they get their set of words, and then they just drag the word to the left, and then they're able to create their poem. So this is a great way to even get boys. A lot of times, sometimes boys will be very shy writing poetry, but if you use magnetic poetry, I find that all the kids, girls, boys, find it fun and exciting to do. Another way you can create poetry is through word clouds. Tuxedo has word cloud shaped poems, like that diamond one I was telling you about, but here's some heart ones. And there's a lot of examples of that as well. Basically, what the students do is they take a shape and then they write adjectives. They can include a bunch of adjectives to go with that shape, or the topic, or memories, or experiences, or ways to just and describe what's happening. So if it's like, for example, Christmas tree, then the poem can be about Christmas, but it's within the Christmas tree. VoiceThread is a great place to be able to have a class poetry presentation. Now, the reason why I like this is you have all of your classes. What they do is each of them, you can pick a topic, or you can just say, okay, this is my 3rd grade class, my 4th grade class, and we're going to write poetry based on, and then you can give them a topic, or you can let it be whatever poem they want to write and contribute. So what I would suggest is that you have them each write the poems, edit it in class, and then they can illustrate these. And with VoiceThread, their poem comes in the center along with the illustration, and then they can speak. They can actually recite their poetry aloud with other, and other students can follow this as well. So I think it's a really good idea to be able to do this with students. The great thing is also they can even choose their favorite poems that they really like. That's another idea. They can put them up there, and then what they can do is that they can with the poems, they can say what elements they like, the literary elements, because there's a doodle in VoiceThread. So they can actually circle areas and say, this is a metaphor. That means the snow. They make the snow. This metaphor is showing how cold the snow is, or something like that. So it's a great way to analyze poetry as well. And the great thing about VoiceThread is you get the speaking, the listening, you get the writing, and the reading. All of the 4 skills are being taught with VoiceThread. VoiceThread, you do have to register for. It takes a little time, so it will take time for that kind of a project. You probably need at least a week to do all of that. Yes, and Peggy George says that you can create your own drawings and upload it to VoiceThread too, and that's true. You can even, in the past, what I've done is had students create like a PowerPoint image and just take a screenshot, or on Photoshop, just an image. They can even do it on Pic Collage or something, and then they upload the image. Storybird.com has a lot of examples of poetry books, or your students can write books of poetry, and they can get it illustrated. So that's practicing writing skills there with visuals as well. You can have students recite poems with an avatar. Telegami has avatars and is great for adults. For kids and children, you may want to try Yakit or Chatterpix for kids. And then there's also Voki. Voki is really great. So Yakit and Chatterpix for kids are both iOS apps, but Voki is actually an app, and it is also it's also on the web as well. And so I noticed that that VoiceThread is no longer free. Well, I mean, I signed up for it a while back, so I guess mine is still free. But thank you so much for letting us know that, NTP, because I didn't realize that it wasn't free. So that is one thing to note. Your students can create a poetry portfolio. Now, I list very different tools. If you go to teacherbootcamp.com, you'll see I mentioned Edubuncy, I mentioned Canva, and Glockster. Glockster is a great place to find different, and the great thing is you can find examples there that students have created themselves. With this poetry portfolio, this is a teenager, and she is illustrated. And when you click on each of these little icons, these images, you will be taken to a poem she wrote. And this is just how she, an image for that poem that she chose. Now, there's different forms of poetry, and the great thing is that there's a lot of teachers who have created some amazing posters on EduGlockster that showcase different poets of a time and make it very interactive. With Glockster, you can add images, you can add video, you can add audio, so it really makes a poem animated and come to life. Pinterest, you can create a portfolio there. This is one person's example of what their poetry portfolio comes there. So if you have students practice different forms of poetry, they're learning that poem style. Maybe they do a shape poem, maybe they do a free verse, maybe they do a limerick, a sonnet, the different types of poem, then they can put it all in one place. And then that becomes their poetry portfolio. Part of a poetry portfolio is also them learning a literary device and also putting that into action. So, for example, you could have, for example, where your students are taught simile, and then they have to write a poem with simile, or they're taught metaphors and they have to write, or an allegory or some other literary device. So you can have them do that as well. They can also analyze different poems and then write responses to them, or critiques, like and just go through the history, what they think the poet was trying to say, what if it was a metaphor for, and learn about the history and things like that. Your students can animate their own poems and create them as videos, which is very, very cool. Or you can learn with poems that are on video. So some lessons plans that you find with poems that are recited or have these cool animated, beautiful videos. So there's a lot of short videos on YouTube and also TED.com here. They have them. But the great thing is that they're animated. Sometimes they have a beautiful cartoons and stop motion picture that goes with it. It's really beautiful. So ed.ted.com has not only a video of someone reciting poetry or the poem, but they also have lesson plans for different age groups. So all you have to do is go to TED.com and do a search for poetry, and you can find other different poems. This is one of the my favorites is actually by a teenager, and he talks about high school training ground. So there's a lot where even it's not only one age group, it's not only adults, but you can find others reciting poetry at different age groups. One that is made especially for language learners is lessonstream.org. And if you go to the topic of poetry, you're going to find videos. You're going to see the age level. The English level. You can have intermediate to advanced. You're going to find a PDF of different types of activities that go along with that video. And then you're also going to see what kind of skills that they're learning as well. So Lesson Stream is really great for that. Poetryfoundation.org, you'll find a lot of videos there as well, even some for children. There's not a lot, but there are a few videos for children that you'll find here. So even the Children's Garden of Poetry, and you'll find audio as well. So if you teach university students, you can show them these lectures that are about poetry and poets and things like that, from the University of Chicago. And those are more theoretical, so your students would have to have a high advanced level of English, but also it's pretty good for English for academic purposes. Vimeo has been a source to find tons of really beautiful animated great poems, even from especially by students of all ages. So I love watching the poems here. They really touch me. They have such an emotional appeal to them, and they're animated, and I think that's wonderful. And once you show students an example of an animated poem, after they write their poems, get them to be able to create their own. They can create slam poetry. You can show them an example of that. This is one of my favorites, which is called To This Day. Students can create their own drawings and make it as a video, or but Vimeo is just a site where you can see examples and you can upload poetry. But I'll show you some other places you can create. You can actually create animated videos of poetry. So you can do this with Powtoon is what I recommend, or you can do something with iMovie. I still use iMovie, Windows Media. You can use things like Camtasia, which is free for 30 days and has where you can add in effects, you can add in text. So what you want to do is get a tool or app where you can actually add text and then you can transition. So students will be able to or they can just have it to where they make like stop motion or something and they don't have to have necessarily the text. But I do like it with text. Explain everything is really great. Screen-o-matic, screencast. Um, there's a lot of ways to do that. And now I'm going to show you some different poetry apps. These are also listed in the blog post, different apps. There's 11 that I recommend, so I've made some updates recently this week of 11 really great poetry apps for teaching poetry. So one is from, of course, the one we looked at, which was the poetryfoundation.org, has an app. You can go by emotion, which is really great because that's a great way to, um, for students, they can do a search based on their emotion or something they're interested in, an emotion they're interested in exploring and see how different poets deal with that emotion or write poetry is emoting that emotion or expressing that emotion. This is really cool app. This is for iOS and Android. I know Christina will like that. But it's called Social Poetry. And what you do is you and your friends write a poem together. So that's really awesome that you're able to do that. It does have, it's like magnetic poetry. So you get a bunch of words too. And then you can drag and drop to kind of help you create that. And you can share it online as well. So that's really, really great. PoeticPower.com is really good too. You can actually, what I like about Poetic Power is you can look at the type of poem there is and then see the structure. And then after, students actually fill out the different structures. So here it's like starts with an A, starts with a B, starts with a D, and this is an ABC poem. So it walks them through different types of poetic forms and literally gives it to them line by line, prompts them what to write. So that can be very helpful. Imagechef.com has a lot of ways that you can visualize your poems. This one is a word cloud and it lets you add all kinds of text so your students can put a poem within that shape. There's a Fridge Poems app. Once again, that is magnetic poetry. So you compose a bunch of different poems and you get a bunch of ideas as well, words right there. One of the best apps out there, unfortunately, it's only for iOS, is the Poetry Creator versus iOS app. It's really great. There's just so much that you can do with it. You can, of course, do magnetic poetry. It also has a Mictionary where it'll mix words around and things like that. Instant poetry is another way that you can add images to poems. But this, once again, has where you drag and drop to make a poem. And what's great about this is that when you do this with mobile device, then that's a great way for students. They just touch the words and put them together, and that is a different way of creating poem. It's very hands-on to be able to move this with your fingers and create a poem on an image. Haiku Popper is also, it's a game. So they've made creating a haiku or learning about haikus into a game. So you get the actual haiku. You get different words, and those words, when you click them, they form a haiku. So that's a really fun game. It's a way to create a haiku, but also it's a game where you actually choose the words. HaikuJam.com. This is where you and two other random people on the web, these aren't ones that you actually meet. These are strangers, and all three of you come together and you create a haiku. So usually what you do in this app is you'll create the first line, and then other person will create the second, and so forth. Yeah, I love that's a great point, Peggy. It says that it allows you to collaborate with other people, and that's really important. It also has you focus on context clues, because when you're writing a poem with somebody else, then what you're doing is you're taking their words, and then you have to come up with a line that matches what they already wrote. So you're also studying language as well. So I think that's really wonderful. Foodpass.com is another way to create a haiku. It's an iOS app. For children, it's really easy to use this one. This is called the Name Poem app, and anyone can actually do this. What they do is they can add an image, they take their name, the first letters of their name, and they create a poem with this app. Of course, you can do this in real life as well. So thank you so much for coming today. You can find all the resources actually at teacherrebootcamp.com, tag poetry. So, or even if you just go to teacherrebootcamp.com, the last two posts are to celebrate National Poetry Month and have tons and tons of ideas. So thank you all so much for coming today, and I hope you have a wonderful, wonderful weekend.